I thought since I've got some tenons to thread lap today, I'd make a demo video of how I do it. So this is the thread I use. It's embroidery cotton, and it has these, it's loosely spun like that, and it has 6 sub strands when you spread it open like that. And what I do is I divide it into 2 lots of 3 like that, and so there you've got 2 lots of 3 threads, and I separate the whole skein, which you have to do by stretching it all the way out and running the spin out, separating the two things. A little bit fiddly, you have to be careful not to end up with a tangle, a mare's nest. But this is the thread I'm actually going to use, and I've already done it, split it and wound the 2 resulting 3-ply lengths onto a bobbin, and you can see there that each is made up of 3 smaller threads, and those threads individually are a fairly loose spun 2-ply, and that's fine. You come up like this with a nice thickness thread for winding your tenon with. It's not too thick, not too thin, but it also, because it's quite soft spun like that, and you can even sort of flatten it out into the 3 threads, it's quite good for making a nice flat lay on your tenon. So thread's ready. The other thing you need is grease. This is just ordinary commercial cork grease. And obviously I've already got the tenon nicely cleaned out any, removed the old lapping, cleaned out any residue in these combings on it, these turned grooves on it. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to apply a fairly generous helping of grease onto the wood. And just make sure I got it spread reasonably evenly everywhere. Just a little bit more right there. So that's ready to go. And then I'm right-handed, so I'm going to show you how I do this right-handed. I'm going to put the bobbin on a dowel on my rubbish bin down here, where it will be held by the table legs, and some other sticks that are in the bin. Can I show you that? Where is it? I'll have to do this with the camera on selfie. Where have we gone? Oh yes, down there. So there we are. I've put the bobbin on the dowel and it's across the bin, so it'll spin freely but not pull towards me, so I can just pull up an end and it will run free for me as I work. So I'm going to hold the work in my left hand and the thread in my right, so I've got the tenon pointing to my right, and I'm going to start by just laying an end of it, of the thread, onto the tenon, not too far down, and then I'm going to take it round the top groove like this and just lay it across itself and into the next groove, and reasonable amount but not a huge amount of tension, with it tensioned over the top of my thumb, and then I rotate the joint of the flute towards me and bring it round and just guide it into the next groove. These are quite fine grooves on this flute, so it's going to lay pretty close immediately. Sometimes the grooves are rather coarser and you kind of need to fill them with the first layer of thread onto the flute. And you don't need to tie a knot or anything, it will just hold itself on. Sometimes if they're being a bit tricky, you can just put a dot of super glue and glue down the first end of your thread if you find that helpful, but it's not really necessary. This flute, it doesn't have any cracks, but sometimes if I've repaired cracks in the tenon, I will actually glue the whole of the first layer of lapping thread onto it, but this one doesn't need that. So I'm just going to systematically wind all the way on. Just make sure when it's resting on my thumb, it's catching against these ends. I want them to lay tidy. But we'll soon cover them up. And you don't want too much tension, just enough to hold it neatly in place. If you put on a lot of tension, it accumulates and can compress the wood. You know what happens if you wind a string round and around your finger. So you don't want too much tension, just enough for it to be secure on the tenon. And you always do this with you're winding over away from you, whether you're right-handed or left-handed. If you were left-handed, you do the same thing. I know I'm doing this by winding it towards me, by turning the tenon, but if you wind it round and round, which you don't really want to do because that puts more twist into it. So once you've got going, you don't wind it round and round by hand. You do it this way, but it's always over away from you, not under away or under or over towards, always over away. And this actually makes sense when you come to putting the joints of the flute together, because whichever way around you hold them, you know, one in your left hand, one in your right hand, and as you put them together, you twist, and you will tend to twist with your away from you with your dominant hand. And when you do it like that, you don't assemble the flute against the lay of the thread, which might tend to make it come undone or loosen. It's not critical, it's not a huge big deal, it should be on well enough anyway, but it's just one of those little help things. So I'm nearly down to the end of the first lay at the shoulder of the tenon, and when I reach that there, I'm just going to hold it off tight like that. It won't come undone, and I'm going to give it a good slather of grease and rub that in around. Make sure I've got plenty. And I am, of course, going to check the fit, because what you don't want to do is to end up too fat. And I don't think there's a huge amount of clearance on these joints. So here I have the head, the barrel socket, and I'm just going to try that over. And that is already making some contact. So we're probably not going to need more than one more full layer. You sometimes get ones with quite a big gap, and you need 3 or even 4 layers of thread. Just make sure I've got plenty of grease on there. The cotton will absorb the grease. It doesn't matter how much you put on at this stage, you end up having to keep greasing it for a while once it's done. So I'm going to just do a slightly tighter pull on the thread at the ends here, just to make them a bit more secure. And I'm going to start coming back up the tenon. Again, still laying it side by side at the moment, or very nearly so. And complete another layer, and then we'll grease and test the fit again. I've chosen this colour thread because I think it looks nice against the crocus wood, and also the case is lined with a somewhat darker blue velvet, and I think this will just look nice when it's disassembled in the case against that. Because of the greasing, you end up with your lapping looking a good bit darker than the thread you start with. So it's just a little aesthetic detail. It really doesn't matter. I quite often use black thread, but if you do use a coloured thread and you want it to come out a particular sort of colour, bear in mind that the grease will darken it 2 or 3 shades. Just got a little bit wide in my lays there. That's where it's useful that the thread will split sometimes over a lump. It just helps you to lay a nice flat lay, whereas if you use a too thick thread, you end up with a very lumpy finish. Not a nice smooth one. And if you use too thick a thread, you lose out on your ability for fine adjustment of the sort of the profile, the final shape of your lapping. I'm nearly up to the top again. And I'm just going to go a little bit tighter here, because this is where taking it apart, putting it together can just pull the end of the lapping off if you do it too loose at the ends, and you don't want that to happen particularly. Right, more grease. You do use quite a lot of grease doing this. Okay, and test fit to the socket again. Ooh. This is where you have to be very careful, because you don't want to crack the socket by forcing it, but also the thread will compress the new lapping, so you do just have to test it. There's no use doing it too loose. You see all the grease that's squeezed out around there? I'm just going to wipe that off and reapply it. This isn't going to need any extra thread, I don't think. It might need a little profiling. In fact, I think I'm going to take a bit off there. I'm going to lay it out to the end first and just do some tight ones there, and then run it back in, not doing it quite side by side because it was a bit tight there. We'll try it like that. Some more grease, so you do it by feel. What you don't want to end up with, obviously, is with it rocking in the socket. Sometimes it can be useful to just do it slightly thicker at the outer and inner ends of the tenon, so that you get those fit, and then fill in any dish in the middle. That's a bit better. I think that's going to be okay. More squeezed out grease, put it back on. Just needs a bit more grease to get it down to the end. Otherwise, I may have to unwind the whole of that second layer and spread it out a bit more to make it thinner. And we'll just see. It's relatively unusual to only need 2 layers of thread. You quite often, and this is where you just don't force it too much, because that's when you can crack a socket. Yep, that's a bit tighter than I like, so I'm going to have to unwind the whole of that second layer and redo it with it a bit more widely spaced, so that it is thinner and doesn't take up quite as much thickness. And as you can see, I'm winding it back onto the bobbin when I have to do this, so that we don't end up with tangles everywhere. I've got these bobbins from a visit to the old there's a bobbin mill in Cumbria. It's a sort of industrial archaeological site, but it's still working. If you visit there and you go to the machine room, they'll actually make some bobbins in front of you, and you can pick them up, made from birch or hazel. Right, that's got that off. I'm going to put some more grease onto that first level. It's amazing how much grease this thread absorbs. It's one of the reasons that you don't have to worry about waterproofness. It ends up pretty waterproof. So I'm just going to feel that again. Okay, that isn't tight at the bottom. So I'm going to lay it up a bit more just at the bottom end. I'm doing about 3 or 4 turns in from the end and then going back over them. I'm just going to get the feel of that so that it's just a snug fit. There we are. But that's rocking at the moment because it's not level all the way out. I think that needs just a little bit more. At that end, and I'm doing these quite tight. That feels about right. So what I'm now going to do is I'm just going to go in a fairly quick spiral out to the outer end, and I'm going to do the same thing at the top end of the lapping. I'm just going to do some tight turns at the very outer end of the tenon and build that up a bit, and again test fit, and that's about right. And now it's not rocking, so now I'm just going to fill in, this time working back down without doing them quite side by side. I'm going to do them a little bit spread out from each other as I go back down. But I'm also eyeballing it, looking for, if there's any sort of obvious troughs to fill in as I go. And you can tell them to some extent by where you get grease showing. It'll squeeze out in a trough, and you'll be able to see a place that you need to lay a bit more thread into. Okay, nearly back down. And that looks reasonably even. So again, I'm just going to try and test fit it. And you see that's gone on now much more easily than when I had the 2 full layers. Always twist, never just push. And again, I can see from the grease, there are some places where I can afford a little more thread. I'm just going to sort of fill back in. It's nice if you can do completely smooth layers, but this will pack down and become smooth. And obviously the way it was, 2 full layers was too much. I think that's going to be about it. The beauty of this, of course, is that you can always redo it. I'm going to stop at that because I think that's about right. So I don't bother in any way fastening off the end because I might want to pick it up and redo it, and the grease will hold it down quite adequately. So I'm just going to simply cut that, and then I'm going to slather on another good amount of grease. But if I need to adjust it, I'll be able to scratch that end back up and either remove some thread or add in a bit more, or just relay it a bit to change the distribution. Okay, this is what I mean about when you put it together. You hold one part, usually the upper part of the flute, in your left hand and the lower part in your right hand, and when you put them together you twist the right hand over away and the thread's wound round it this way so you don't undo your thread. So, and there we have it. That is a nice tight joint, but not too tight. But as I said, that's going to go on taking up grease for a while, and may need some adjustment as well. I'm going to do the other end, but I'm not going to make a video of that.